Hello there. As discussed in one of our previous videos, time travel, kind of complicated and often a bad idea. And as a result, certain agencies have been created to regulate it. But who'd be stupid enough to mess with the fabric of reality itself, with the cause of events? As we all know from the butterfly effect, how many different ways this can go wrong are exponential. Look at what happened with Anorax and the temporal weapon ship that he created. No matter how many times he restored the Cranium Imperium, he never really got it quite right, and all these other races kept reappearing, disappearing, existing, not existing, over and over and over again. Basically, it was a cluster of a situation. And another instance of that is the Temporal Cold War. The Temporal Cold War is a very complicated, overlapping series of events that take place across several centuries throughout the Alpha and Beta quadrants, involving multiple different species. Before we get into that breakdown though, I'd want to quickly, shamelessly, self-plug my own company along with my partners. It's called Alternative World. Right now, hopefully, I've remembered to put up some kind of artwork, which is something that we are currently selling on the website. Now this, as I've explained on other videos, is not a normal YouTuber store. It's not necessarily on their stuff that is linked to this, although there is a lot of science fiction and nerdy stuff coming. It's mostly alternative culture and other such things on the website. Some of it is custom designed by my partner and another artist, others are bought from stockists, and basically it's our first step into trying to create our own company and ultimately lead to having our own store. So any support you can give, check out the store. It's linked in the description below, but it is alternativeworld.co.uk. It can currently only deliver to the United Kingdom, but I'm hoping at some point soon to expand that, as well as the range that's on there. With that out of the way, let's get into exactly what was the Temporal Cold War. And in a nutshell, as I said, it was a conflict that took place over multiple centuries. And the reason I call it a Cold War, because we see this thing get hot several times. It's more like a game of 3D chess across time. Different elements moving different pawns in different centuries, all to try to create certain events that are favourable to them. Now we do know there are certain key players and certain specific races that are more important than others, one of which we'll get to at the end, but we'll cover the basic fundamental races and players we see, and then we'll talk about what we know about the puppet masters behind it all. Now, as I said, it involves several agencies and different groups from different centuries. We know there are elements from the 26th century, such as Future Guy, as he's affectionately known, who was the one who was puppeteering the Suliban. So by extension, we've got the Suliban. The Suliban are a race of humanoid species originated in the Alpha Quadrant. They're at some point displaced from their homeworld. Whether that had something to do with the Cold War has never been fully established. Some of their race would form into an organization known as the Cabal. The Cabal was basically a terrorist organization linked to Future Guy, who gave them generous genetic modifications and technology and scientific knowledge to enhance their civilization, make them more powerful in their own timeline as long as they did the things he wanted them to do. Realistically, this could indicate that the Future Guy and his ilk were actually Suliban from the future. That would be a little obvious, and I think it's more complicated than that. But certainly the Suliban were benefiting from this, at least in the short term. But they were also gaining themselves a great deal of enemies in the process. The Suliban were one piece. They were being thwarted by adversaries from the future, from the 31st century, representatives of the Temporal Accords. One of their immediate threats in their own time period, bear in mind the Future Guy and his other factions lack the ability to time travel, but this other group were actually in their own time period, and that would be the Tholians. Exactly who was puppeteering them or what involvement they had is not clear. The Tholians claimed that they were actually trying to protect the timeline and prevent changes, but they too were interested in commandeering technology from the future to enhance themselves as well as other such things. And the Tholians, not the most trustworthy source quite often. Their motives are often shrouded in mystery, and they can be a bit unpredictable. That being said, they did seem to disengage from battle with the Enterprise once their goal was taken away from them, possibly indicating that the Tholians were telling the truth, that they were actually simply trying to maintain order and stability, or at least keep it on track. But that does still mean that someone was puppeteering them from the future. another race that were somewhat involved in the Temporal Cold War, but didn't seem to be, I wouldn't say, one of its major players, although they did have a serious impact, with the Sphere Builders. Their efforts to alter the timeline were mostly self-destructive ultimately, and they were defeated. But they knew in the future they would be defeated by the Federation and others brought together by humanity, which is why they tried to use the Xindi as their pawns to destroy humanity. In turn, humanity was then also contacted by Future Guy to be given information to actually thwart the Xindi, who were given knowledge and technology from the future. So once again, we have another faction, humans. Now, whether we like to admit it or not, humans were certainly one of the factions involved in the Temporal Cold War. Future Guy and the Suliban had direct contact with them, as did Daniels, as we know him as Daniels anyway, who was a time agent from the future. He would often give them technology, give them knowledge, and give them an edge when dealing with others, such as the ability to see through Suliban cloaking devices, for example. And although Starfleet and humanity's involvement was more along the lines of we don't really want anything to do with this and we agree with our descendants in the far future that realistically stabilizing and maintaining a straight arrow of a timeline is better, time, as we know, is not entirely fluid, and with different elements often going back in time, both naturally and artificially, time is often being rewritten in different ways, subtly all the time, meaning that there's always going to be a little bit of tempering and a little bit of change. And there are beings such as the creatures that live in the Celestial Temple or the Vision Wormhole, the Wormhole aliens or the Prophets, whatever you want to call them, actually exist outside of space-time and don't necessarily fully comprehend linear time, at least not in the same way that we do. Therefore, time is a mess. Now that we have the basic overview of how the Temporal Cold War was fought, what were its actual gains? Now, we do know that the people from the future, although we don't know exactly what they wanted, they were trying to gain power for themselves, whether that means for their entire species or for them individually. There were different factions, although it's never clear exactly how many. We do know that different organizations and time agencies from different time periods are actually involved in the Cold War. We know that the Romulans of the future were somewhat involved in it, but as yet we don't know exactly how, as we have seen Romulan time agents going back into Earth's history trying to affect that. We've also seen that the Temporal Integrity Commission of at least the 29th century was also involved in trying to restore the timeline, which brings into an interesting paradox. Were different time agencies from different time periods, or the same time agency, actually forced to cooperate with elements of themselves from different time periods? And it's a mind-boggling thought as to at what point does an agent from the 29th century step aside for an agent from the 30th century, for example. Is it just when they meet each other, or because we've got predestination paradoxes and other such things? Did the 30th century agent already know about it or not? It's an interesting and headache-inducing thought. Bottom line, all these different groups and individuals were moving pieces around a four-dimensional chessboard, affecting different people in different centuries, going back as far as the 20th century on Earth, at least, and as far forward as the 31st century with the Federation. Humans were involved in this at multiple different stages, but we know that the hot battleground of the Temporal Cold War was focused in on the mid-22nd century, the time of the 2150s, specifically around the same time that humanity will launch its first deep space Warp 5 capable starship, and the first of a new generation of explorer type vessel that humanity would use to usher itself into deep space. Around this time, other agencies began playing with the chess pieces around this time period, different factions, such as Future Guy, again affecting the Suliban, someone else with the Tholians. Humans and maybe other agencies of the future, particularly from the Temporal Accords, interacting with humans of the 22nd century. The Sphere Builders messing with the Xindi, at least from 100 years earlier, from the 21st century into the 22nd century. So you see how this all is. They literally are messing with different individuals at different time periods, making subtle changes in the hope that they can outmaneuver, or possibly destroy someone else. We can infer that people from the future, despite the fact they want to be affected by these changes in the timeline and benefit from them, are probably operating from some kind of temporally shielded location, because if someone, say, was to instruct the Tholians to wipe out the ancestor of whoever future guy is, he'd suddenly cease to exist and the whole war would come to an end. So there has to have been as well some kind of core groups that were actually protected from these changes in the timeline. But I think the Temporal Cold War was deliberately ambiguous. Of course, time agents in the future, and even Future Guy, was hesitant to share information with anyone that might not keep that information confidential or may misuse it. For example, Future Guy refused to tell humanity about the impending Xindi attack, even though he could have done it. Because humans, as Archer even put it, probably wouldn't have believed them. That something so fantastic, because although humans are more open to the idea of time travel, like the Vulcans, they kind of didn't believe it was possible. And as a result, they would have probably dismissed such a claim, although it may have strengthened the Suliban's case if they had done this, but it also may have made humans believe the Suliban were behind it, as they did initially when Archer was first encountered. So it's all very complicated and all very messy. Now, one of the major players, which I said we would come back to, I've actually done a video on before, and I'll hopefully link it up here, see if I remember to do that as well, and that is the Nakul, led by Vosk. Vosk was one of the certainly most influential and messy individuals who was cocking up the timeline. He went back as far as 20th century Earth again and affected humanity's history. He also did a number of other alterations and was possibly one of the major puppet masters behind several of the factions, of which we only got to see or at least allude to a few. It's reasonable to conclude, for example, that the Tholians were working for someone different than Future Guy, although it is plausible that Future Guy was playing two factions in the same time period against each other for the reason of benefiting him at some point in the future. In other words, he may have wanted the Tholians and the Suliban to fight so that he was benefiting from that. So he may have even been controlling both. I'm just putting it out there. It's possible. Maybe not, but it's possible. Because, quite frankly, in this realm of four-dimensional chess, anything is possible. Ultimately, the Nakul were defeated, and it seemed to restore much of the timeline, but as we know recently, there are still elements of that Cold War still brewing away in the background. It's plausible that Daniel simply wanted to remove Starfleet and Archer and other influential people from the 22nd century rather, out of the events of the Cold War by simply telling them and giving them a little light show that everything's good now, it's all fine. It's again possible he was simply deceiving them. So, what does that leave the Temporal Cold War? Well, it's seemingly never gone away. It's still raging on. We know that time agents, as well as possibly even travelers, are somewhat involved in this conflict. In what capacity? It's not clear, because again, to be honest, I think the Temporal Cold War is served narratively by remaining kind of abstract and somewhat undefined. Because if we were to define it, if we were to find out who Future Guy is, which by the way I've got a video coming up on that, because if we were to find out who that was, if we were to know, it may take away some of the mystery. It may even take away some of the intrigue and the interest in the Temporal Cold War. If we were to find out that Daniel's a Future Guy, or we were to, because it could be him time traveling to the 26th century so he can contact someone in the 22nd century before returning to the 32nd century to investigate himself. It also may have been an Nakul. Future Guy may be an AI. He may not be a he may be human. He may be Romulan. He could be a traveller. He could be a Borg. We really do not know exactly what he is. And that, I think, is the way it probably should stay. Because the more we define it, the more conventional it will become. And I think something like this, for the kind of people in the 22nd century, 23rd, 24th, and even 25th centuries, to define a conflict on this kind of scale is beyond human comprehension, beyond the scope of the Federation's abilities to really deal with in those times. It's more something that the Federation of the 32nd century and its sort of contemporary eras are better equipped to deal with. So it's possible, if the story's been continued as we recently saw in Strange New Worlds, with Captain Pike and others, well, more specifically La'an, encountering time agents again and discovering that this thing's all still bubbling on in the background, it's possible that people from the 32nd century may still be dealing with this problem. But what does everyone think? Let me know in the comment section below. If you can hear it barking, that's my dog barking at something. as she likes to do every time I try and record. She probably just wants attention and a belly scratched or something. Whatever I was saying, do that, and tell me your thoughts on whether you like the Temporal Cold War. Do you want to see it return, or do you want to know more about it, or is it something that we kind of want to see, we want to leave for maybe a future date or a future crew to have to really deal with, maybe even deal with it in a short trek, maybe not a short trek, but one of the mini movies they're sort of coming up with soon. Let me know in the comments below. And with that, we are at the end of this video that's rambled on a little longer than I wanted to. Thank you for watching if you've reached all the way to the end. Bye bye.